I'm Rob McNeilly, and it's a pleasure for me to have some time today to speak with Jeffrey Zieg. Jeff, thank you so much for being willing to give some time with your incredibly frantic teaching schedule.
Well, considering the number of years that we've been friends, it's really a pleasure.
Yes, it's 33 years, I think.
At least, huh? 33 years?
I think so.
1980?
1980. I think so, yeah.
Uh-huh.
So, could you say something about yourself, about what you're up to, what's important to you, and how you got to be doing what you're doing? Could you do that?
Yes, from a professional level, I assume. So,
well, that's up to you, Jeff, but yes, probably.
So I have 6 full-time jobs, and one of my jobs is being a therapist, which I very much appreciate. I wish that I had more time to do therapy because I'm well suited for it. It's something that I love to do. Okay. The second job that I have is that I'm the director and the founder of the Milton Erickson Foundation, which was founded in 1979. Dr. Erickson was a member of the original board of directors. The third thing that I do, which is part of the Erickson Foundation, is that organizing conferences. The Erickson Foundation doesn't exist to solely promote the work that Milton Erickson began. The Erickson Foundation is about integration, about effectiveness in psychotherapy. We tried to bring together the best minds, the best contributors to psychotherapy, and we give them a platform, a stage upon which they can speak. So we organize 4 major conferences: a conference on Erickson that's held every 3 years or 4 years, a conference on brief therapy that's held every 2 or 3 years, our big conference, which is in December, called the Evolution of Psychotherapy. And for an American audience, they would understand that's Woodstock for psychotherapists. And this is a conference that I organized in 1985. We have it every 4 years. Originally every 5 years, but 85 conference was amazing. We had people like Bruno Bettelheim and Virginia Satir and Carl Rogers and Rollo May and R.D. Lang. It was a tremendous conference, and one of the great meetings of minds in the history of psychotherapy. But the understructure, the subtext of that, was to bring together thinkers and talk about the commonalities that makes therapy work. Our 4th meeting that we have is called a couples conference, and it's a regional conference where we bring together the best contributors to the areas of relationship and intimacy. So that's my 3rd job. And then another job that I have is a publisher. We publish books about psychotherapy, and I have 2 publishing companies, Zeig, which is my personal publishing company, and also the Erickson Foundation Press, which we publish in the area of Ericksonian psychotherapy. And then another job that I have is writing, and I have done more than 20 books, mostly edited, that appear in 14 different languages. And then my 6th job is that I spend time traveling and teaching, trying to inspire the therapists. And I consider myself an integrative experiential psychotherapist, that people get better by virtue of the experiences that they live, not by virtue of the information that they receive. And that's very much within the genre of an Ericksonian tradition.
Yes, precisely. And I know Erickson said, whatever you do, get your clients to do something.
Right.
Not just focus on. So could you then address the question, why, you've already spoken to it, but why would a therapist who does not at the moment use hypnosis or know about it, why would a therapist want to learn about it? What benefits would you expect a therapist to have from acquainting themselves with the principles and practices of hypnosis in general?
Well, hypnosis is by design an experiential method. And when I'm doing hypnosis with someone, it's not giving the person information. It's not explaining to the person things about their history or about their attitude or about their relationship patterns. It's about living change. So hypnosis is the mother of all experiential methods. And once somebody immerses themselves in learning hypnosis, they get a more thorough experiential understanding of experiential methods. Now, another thing that's really important about hypnosis is that it's the technology of evocative communication. We could say that communication is both informative and evocative. And informative communication, we're in the realm of science. If you want to learn about science, mathematics, you do that through the information that you receive. If you want to feel something, if you want to change your state, this is evocative communication. And evocative communication is in the realm of arts. So when you go to a movie, when you go to the theater, when you go to a concert, you don't go to these places because you want to get information. You go to these places because you want to have an experience that leads you to feel things in a different way, or an experience that changes your state. So when patients come to us, they often come because they're locked into a state. For example, let's say they're locked into the state of being apathetic or not motivated, and they come to us because they want help in changing their state. Now, if I didn't understand something about hypnosis, I wouldn't have a technology at my hands and my fingertips that would help me to help people to change their state. So we learn that if somebody is moving from the conscious, normal state of awareness into a hypnotic state, we learn a mechanism, how to do an induction, how to speak to that person, how to use evocative communication. Once we learn that as a model for formal hypnosis, then we often segue and we use that same communication in a way that Dr. Erickson called naturalistic. It's hypnotherapy without trance. Dr. Erickson himself said that he only used hypnosis 15% of the time, but 100% of the time he was using techniques from hypnosis evocatively. So, you know, I spent more than 6 years intermittently studying with Dr. Erickson, and I moved to Phoenix for the last 2 years of his life. Now, over that time, the amount of actual content that he taught me was minimal. He was of the belief that if you wanted to learn content, you could do that from books. But he was in the people building business, so consistently doing things that were evocative, using hypnosis and stories and metaphors, tasks, directives that would help me to be a better Jeff Zieg, not the kind of education that I had when I was in graduate school, where I had to memorize the number of lumens of illumination that you needed for dark adaptation in the human eyeball in order to graduate. I can tell you an anecdote. When I visited Dr. Erickson, I was graced because I could stay at his home. He had a very modest home and a very small guest house. And I was putting away my things, and as I was putting them away, I saw that there was a box. The box contained some old reel-to-reel tapes. And even at that time, they were in danger of eroding just from age. And I knew that the tapes were lectures that Dr. Erickson had done in the 1950s and 60s. Now, in the 1950s and 60s, there were not psychologists, social workers, counselors. He was speaking to medical audiences. So I asked, could I listen to one of those tapes? And by the way, could I put them on cassette so that they would be preserved for history? And he said, yes, of course. So I started listening to this tape. And he's speaking to a medical audience, and he's saying, hypnosis. Hypnosis has been known, and hypnosis can be realized. And hypnosis is realized in so many ways, and it's been known to you in history. And suddenly I'm starting to get a little woozy. And I say to him, Dr. Erickson, I listened to this lecture that you did for physicians, and it was like one long hypnotic induction. And he said to me, oh, Jeff, I didn't teach content. I never listened to those old lectures. I taught to motivate. Now, I even get a chill right now when I remember that, because it was so pixelating to me that here was somebody who was teaching to change a state. his teaching was evocative. His teaching was not informative. And he was a master in evocative communication. And probably, I think, was the world's greatest communicator, because he certainly understood how to be informative. He could be informative. His writing was informative. But for somebody who explored the evocative nature of communication, Erickson there was no parallel. And this gets into a question that you were wanting to ask, I think.
Yes. Before we do that, just to comment that hypnosis and Ericksonian hypnosis is not the only approach in therapy that is evocative, but there's something about, as you say, when you use the word technology, there's something about becoming somewhat proficient in hypnosis, where you get your hands on the steering wheel of, you get the hands on the controls of how to do that more intentionally. That's my experience anyhow. Would you have any comment about that?
Yes. Well, I think hypnosis is evocative in ways that other techniques that are experiential are not evocative. Psychodrama is evocative, and Gestalt therapy can be evocative, but the structure of hypnosis, where you're talking to somebody and you're not trying to give them information.
Yes.
You're talking to somebody because you want to help them to modify their attention, to modify the intensity of their experience, to modify their perception, to modify their dissociative ability, to modify their interpersonal responsiveness, to modify their state. Now, this is so that a hypnotic induction seems more like poetry, because poetry is condensed communication that is meant to help you to change your state. Whereas a Gestalt or a psychodrama is an experiential method, it doesn't have the same understructure of how to use communication in ways that are evocative. Now,
and do you think that it might be possible for, say, someone who was using psychodrama as their primary method, if they learned hypnosis, they may be able to bring some of the evocative aspects of hypnosis into their psychodrama or into Gestalt or what, that it could add to these other experiential approaches?
Right. This has always been the intent of the Erickson Foundation. We've never tried to make Ericksonian therapy into a special school of Ericksonian therapy. The word Ericksonian therapy never appeared in print until 1978, when we published the brochure for the first Erickson Congress. But it really wasn't an intent to have a school. The intent was to integrate Ericksonian thinking into the warp and woof of contemporary practice.
Yes, oh, beautiful. So then the question that leads to is, you've spoken very clearly and helpfully about why hypnosis might be something that someone would be interested to learn, but why Ericksonian hypnosis in particular, as distinct from a more traditional hierarchical kind of approach to hypnosis?
Well, in a very simple way, what you said was poignant. It's hierarchical. So traditionally, hypnosis has been this way. It's been outside in. Like the electronic model, you're putting in positive suggestions or you're taking out negative suggestions. So it's like traditionally, hypnosis is based on direct suggestions. You'll be comfortable in an airplane. Cigarettes will taste bad, either positive suggestions or negative suggestions. And the direction of the induction has been outside in. From an Ericksonian perspective, the approach is more inside out. And rather than talking about induction, we can talk about an elicitation model. You elicit the components of hypnosis. You elicit the resources that exist. You elicit the strengths that help the person to change their calcified patterns. So that is a primary difference in a very simplified form about what is an Ericksonian approach compared to what is a traditional approach. But if you want me to take that further, I'm glad to develop.
Yes, in particular, if you could just make some comment about why you think that's important or why that might be helpful for a therapist or for their clients.
Sure. Well, let's think for a minute about art. One of my areas of inquiry is to look at the structure of evocative communication. So I interview artists. I interview painters and composers and writers and poets, and I try to understand the essentially evocative nature of their thinking. And let's take art, painting, for example. Right? A painter has a palette of colors and a canvas and a frame. And within that canvas, the painter has to use what he has on his palette in order to create an evocative experience. Now, if you think about a composer has really four major things. A composer has tone, timbre, rhythm, and harmony. And that's the palette of the composer. And out of those four elements, the composer needs to create an evocative experience for the listener. Now, psychotherapists have at their disposal a different palette. So we can learn how to use gesture, we can learn how to use expression, we can learn how to use tone, we can learn how to use tempo, we can learn how to use proximity, we can learn how to use the prosody of our voice. And we do not explore what we have on our palette. We think that psychotherapy is my mouth to your ears, your mouth to my ears. And that psychotherapy nobody's ever taught me in the course of my career how to use something as simple as gesture to make simple ideas come alive. Now, what Milton Erickson did was he was an explorer of the outer recesses of communication. He explored, how do you use voice tone? How do you use tempo? How do you use the direction of voice in order to elicit responses? And this is more like what an artist would do, would be to explore the medium. And so when you start learning about hypnosis, you start learning about the medium that you have, communication. You start learning how to use elements of that medium to help people to change their state, because you can't change people's state by giving them information. You can't say to an apathetic person, you should be more motivated, or a person who doesn't have self-esteem, you need to have more self-esteem. That's not helpful. We have to have a technology that helps us to help people to move out of their calcified state into a more robust, flexible, fluid state that is ecological to whatever the situation is that they're facing. So when we study hypnosis, we learn how to expand the palette that we have at our disposal, especially when we study Erickson. An anecdote. Right? I think that it was perhaps Seymour Halleck, who was somebody who was president of the American Psychiatric Association, who was visiting Dr. Erickson. And Dr. Erickson was demonstrating an induction. Now remember that when Dr. Erickson was alive, the concept of mind-body didn't really exist. We didn't have the words just to say that we were exploring mind-body connections. Those are relatively recent, within the last 30, 40 years. And so Dr. Erickson wanted to demonstrate that the locus of voice was a sufficient cue to cause a physiological response. So the patient was known to have motion sickness. And Dr. Erickson was doing a neutral induction. The patient had his eyes closed. And the president of the American Psychiatric Association is visiting. And as Dr. Erickson was weaving the induction, he started to move from side to side. Even though the patient had his eyes closed, he was moving from side to side, and the patient developed motion sickness. Now, he was exploring that the direction of voice alone was a sufficient cue to cause a response, not only a response, but a physiological response. So more than any other communicator I ever experienced, Dr. Erickson's interest in using the palette of communication to maximum effect. It was peerless. And I've seen many other great therapists, and they're wonderful. I would be glad to. It was wonderful to spend time with Viktor Frankl and Virginia Satir and Sal Minuchin and Jay Haley and Watzlawick, and to actually have had time with these people, and some of them became friends. And but nobody had that curiosity about exploring communication to that degree. And I think that people seem a little bit baffled sometimes by Erickson, but if I said that what Erickson was, he was somebody who wanted to understand the palette that we have at our disposal, communication, and wanted to be able to use all of the colors that were on that palette in order to have an effect.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it's better to understand Erickson, and then we don't have to worry about hypnosis or not hypnosis.
Mm-hmm.
Hypnosis is wonderful because it's a foundation. It's the mother of all therapies.
Mm-hmm.
Therapy started with hypnosis, with Charcot and with Freud being interested in hypnosis. Mm-hmm. But what I love about hypnosis is that it served to train me to what was possible to do with communication that I had never learned in any other discipline.
And Erickson was, as you say, a masterful virtuoso in this facility. And some people were kind of awestruck by that and paralyzed, but somehow you've been able to listen and learn from that so that your palette has been expanded and continues to expand. And I'm assuming, it's maybe so obvious, but I'd like you to say something about how come that's relevant. It might be a kind of a simplistic question, but you and I know how critical it is, but could you just say something about why it is so relevant for us to have this ability to expand our palette?
Well, if you look into the history of psychotherapy and you understand the fundamental of psychoanalysis, in psychoanalysis you wanted to maximize the therapeutic situation in order to bring the transference center stage.
Mm-hmm.
So if the patient was lying on a couch and the therapist was behind and in back of the patient, and the patient was prompted by the situation to say whatever came to his mind, transference would emerge.
Yeah.
And then you could analyze the transference, which to Freud was the royal road to overcoming the residuals of transference that would contaminate the person's perspective of reality.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if we cast psychotherapy as a situation of not projecting transference into the world, but as a situation of interpersonal influence, of one person trying to impact another person, then when we find that there are certain things that increase the amount of impact, like if you increase the amount of precision, if you modify the amount of precision, you increase the impact. If you modify the density of the communication, you increase the impact. Mm-hmm. If you make the therapy visual, you increase the impact, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. All of the things that we read about psychotherapy primarily are transcripts, where one person is talking to the next person as if information was the royal road to change. Mm-hmm. But 50% of brain processing is visual. And so we need to appeal to people's eyes. We need to do things that make simple messages come alive. And when we learn about Erickson, we see a model of somebody who was exploring the palette of human communication.
So I don't know whether it's simplistic to say that by exploring exactly what you're speaking about and attending to it, we can be more effective in our work and assist clients to move more respectfully and more peacefully and more permanently towards their desired outcome. Am I being simplistic in saying that? Or
not at all. No, because the way the varieties of psychotherapy, of humanistic psychotherapy, you're not going to be a tour guide, you're going to be a companion traveler. Mm-hmm. And if you spend time with Jim Bugenthal, you would have a profound experience just by virtue of being with him. He wouldn't have a strategic goal in mind. Mm-hmm. But from an Ericksonian perspective, we have a strategic goal in mind, and we are more tour guides. We want to maximize the amount of interpersonal impact to help the person to get from point A to point B.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me, to get from a place of being apathetic to a place of being motivated,
Mm-hmm.
for example. So we need to use the technology that we have at our disposal to have an effect. Now, if I think about that in terms of a story, when I was with Dr. Erickson, it was amazing to me that anybody was working that assiduously to have an effect on me, that he was choosing his words surgically, as if a surgeon was using a scalpel, that he was choosing his gestures surgically, that the implication of the words was surgical, that the implication of the gestures was surgical, that everything was condensed to have an impact on me. Now, the effect of that was, emotionally, that I never felt so loved in my life, that anybody would be working that hard to have an effect on me. And it was not just me, but this is the way he was with you, and the way that he was with Stephen Langton or Stephen Gilligan or Jay Haley or Gregory Bateson or Margaret Mead or any of the myriad people with whom he had contact. He really worked to be a very precise communicator, and the effect of that was that you felt loved, important, that somebody was working that hard to make a difference in your life. So that was one component of who Erickson was and how he worked, and I'm certain that came from hypnosis, because in hypnosis we strive to be that kind of precise. When I'm doing an induction, I'm thinking about my gestures and my expression and the tone and the tempo and the direction of my voice and proximity and how people respond to these paraverbal, extraverbal components of communication. Now, if we looked into the field of modern neuroscience and modern social psychology, we would see that there are myriad research studies that demonstrate that people respond to that degree of subtlety. This is not fanciful. We're not just talking hypothetically. Look into the research on priming or social mimicry, and you see that the attributions or the effect of context on human behavior, we see that these effects are robust. They're part of our sociobiology. It's just that nobody else had used these aspects of communication in the history of psychotherapy before Erickson, and he was somebody who explored them as a pioneer. We can stand on his shoulders and continue to develop these ideas.
Yes, and that I guess is something that's going to be important to people watching and listening to this, to know that however wonderful Erickson was, it doesn't mean that we have to be as kind of distant observers. We can learn from him, and people can learn from what he was doing to make their own adaptation, but in that direction, and so be more effective in their work and be more helpful to their clients.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So, I'm sorry, go on.
I don't know where to take that.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
100%.
Well, then maybe we could lead on to the other question, which is, if someone, and really I don't know why anyone wouldn't want to learn how to be more effective and more use their language and interpersonal relationships in a more evocative way, but I don't know why anyone wouldn't want to do that. But should someone be interested to explore this and learn about this, what's your experience? You've been doing a lot of teaching in a lot of different places all over the world, and your own learning. What would be helpful? What have you found is helpful for someone to learn, to be able to explore this wonderful direction of taking therapy?
Yeah, I would say listen to Beethoven. And I did a keynote speech a couple of years ago for an Erickson Congress where I talked about Beethoven and Erickson, and we deconstructed the first minute 40 of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony into 26 components of things that Beethoven did to have impact.
Okay.
And then I compared that to 26 things that Dr. Erickson did to have impact. So, for example, if Beethoven uses recursions, ba-ba-ba-bum, 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 ba-ba-bum, and a recursion is not a repetition. A recursion is a slight variation, theme and variation. Repetitions are boring. So now a recursion is to understand that you can present things to a person, like say you're talking about relaxation in a hypnotic induction, and you're saying to the person, you can feel a sense of ease, a sense of peace inside yourself, a sense of being quiet, a sense that's lenitive. And suddenly you're using the Beethoven principle. You're speaking in terms of recursions, and you're learning that something that musicians do as a matter of course is evocative. And if we could take something about that evocative structure and apply it in everyday life, in therapeutic communication, but also in everyday life. You know, if you listen to the structure of my communication with you, you would notice that I've been using triplicates. You know, you're saying some things. You're saying things that are important. You're saying things that can be really meaningful to people. And we know that if we study really good speakers, we learn that really good speakers, people like Bill Clinton or Obama, they speak in triplicates. And they use slight recursions, but in a pattern of 3. So, okay, so let's see, can we use that in psychotherapy? If we learn that a great novelist uses foreshadowing as an evocative technique, or the musical component to that would be a prelude, and then we can learn that we can do the same things in terms of psychotherapy. And from my understanding, although I never got to talk with Dr. Erickson about it because I didn't have that understanding when he was alive, that what he did was he studied literature. And he studied the structure of even the television programs that he watched, and he understood how those artists impacted, and then he explored how could you use them in a free-flowing interpersonal situation. So this is the essence of my most recent project, which is emotional-impact.com, which is interviewing different artists and trying to come up with an understanding of the methodologies that artists have at their disposal to be evocative, and then bring them back into the warp and woof of my teaching, of my interpersonal communication, certainly of my hypnosis, absolutely to my psychotherapy.
So you're at this is your growing edge. This is your where you're growing, where you're exploring. Now,
and then just to continue that, because I missed part of the thought, I apologize. But, you know, so for me, okay, well, I got this idea that good speakers speak in triplicates. And so, okay, well, now for, you know, some period of time, I put that into my working memory. And I say, okay, what I'm going to do when I do hypnotic inductions, when I am speaking with my patients, is I'm going to speak in triplicates. When I start to do lectures, I say, okay, I'm going to practice this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to try this technique of triplicates, or I'm going to try recursions. And then for a month or so, I'm working on one of these techniques. And I'm using one of these techniques in order to help myself to understand how to build my ability as an impactful communicator until those things come into procedural memory and I don't have to think about them at all in working memory. They're just like brushing your teeth. You just do it because it's an overlearned task. You've done it so many times. So I would enjoin people to study the structure of art, like how does Monet use destabilization in his art, and how could you begin to use destabilization? How does Monet use an evocative impressionism, and how could you be able to use that in your communication? Because, by the way, psychotherapists know practically nothing about evocative communication, whereas artists have been studying this for centuries, millennia. Psychotherapy is, started in 1885 when Freud became interested in the psychological aspects of medicine. We are infants in understanding our own field. We haven't gotten into our, early childhood education.
It's so fascinating to hear you speak about this because I'm not sure how serious you are in suggesting that any therapist should actually study Beethoven or Monet.
Completely.
You are? Okay. Because that's what you've done. And I can imagine that someone else might have another way. But but clearly you're encouraging people to look outside of the confines of textbooks and traditional approaches, and to explore some of the contextual elements that contribute to that.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah, because if you want to advance your field, you have to get outside of the box.
Yes.
And you can't advance the field by staying within the four corners of that box.
Sure.
You have to get out of the box and look for other ways of helping the field to evolve. And our field has been very slow to evolve, whereas art evolves at a much more geometric pace.
Now, just to be clear, are you suggesting that if someone wanted to learn hypnosis and learn evocative language forms, that they should avoid formal hypnotic training programs? Should they keep away from workshops and such things?
Well, they should attend my workshops.
But no one else, is just yours, yes?
That's right. Well, yours too, but that's the only concession that I'm willing to make.
It's so great because, I mean, I know Erickson said, don't try and be like me, you couldn't anyhow, be like yourself, and that's precisely where you're going with that.
But I do believe that learning formal hypnosis, learning traditional hypnosis, you know, Kay Thompson, who was one of Dr. Erickson's first generation students, would suggest that you take the fundamental workshop 5 or 10 times, and that you learn the fundamentals very well. And this is like, you know, you can't pick up an instrument and suddenly be playing that instrument in a completely, fluid form. You need to learn the scales. You need to learn the fingering of how to do the instrument. You need to learn the tradition of what that music is. So you need to start at the beginning, and going to courses that are fundamental on hypnosis gives you the background from which you can learn more about evocative communication. But without that background, you're not going to be able to get very far.
I think it was Jay Haley that said that Erickson invited him to learn all of the classical hypnotic phenomena and processes and practice them very, very thoroughly, and then forget them. Yes.
I think that that's very good advice, and I would second that advice.
Now, is there anything, when you look back to what we've been speaking about what you're up to, a whole lot of things, goodness knows how you do all those things, about hypnosis and how evocative communication is relevant, and Ericksonian approach in particular leads into that, and how someone might acquaint themselves with that, and then, as you're doing, extend their learning more. When you look back to what we've been speaking about, is there anything else that you would like to add, or anything that we've spoken about that you would like to emphasize?
Well, there are forms that when you're learning fundamental hypnosis, you learn these forms. And they would be like a ballet dancer that was learning forms. And you have to practice these forms until they get from your working memory into your procedural memory. So forms that we learn when we study fundamental hypnosis would be like using simple truisms. You're here and you're listening to me, and you can begin to understand the ways that you can use some of these things that I've been talking about. Now, that was using some truisms and an embedded command. So we learn some fundamental forms of communication that are evocative and that are used, for example, to guide people's attention and to elicit more hypnotic, quote-unquote, states. Now, in order to do those and learn those forms like truisms and yes sets and embedded commands and presuppositions and dissociation statements and double dissociation statements and implied causatives, this is a grammar, and you're learning a grammar. And you take a fundamental hypnosis course to learn the grammar of that kind of evocative communication. And once you learn the fundamentals of that evocative communication, then you're more equipped to be able to do an induction and make the induction robust. Now, if you take an education in traditional hypnosis, you learn an induction technique.
Yep.
And you memorize an induction technique. And you do the induction technique repeatedly over and over again, which, by the way, is a good way of learning. Learn an induction technique, do it on 50 people, and learn the variety of ways in which people respond to that induction technique. Well, once you do that, then you understand the understructure of induction. I don't have an induction that I use. I invent an induction for every situation because I understand how to use hypnotic language, and I understand what the goals are that I'm trying to construct, so that I can tailor an approach to the uniqueness of the person and the goals that the person has, and each induction becomes an improvisation. Now, you can't improvise until you learn the fundamentals. So you have to learn the fundamentals, and then you create the improvisations. But really important for people to take a hypnosis course. I think every therapist should take a hypnosis course and learn the fundamentals of what I would call evocative communication. And then once they've learned that, they don't need to spend the next 40 years learning to become a journeyman and learning to begin to master some of these ideas. But just the training will help them to be better Gestalt therapists or better cognitive behavior therapists or better EMDR practitioners. Whatever it is that they're learning, there's a transfer of training that helps you to be more effective and more impactful in whatever school that you're learning. Once you learn that, then you can go to other fields, other disciplines like art, like improvisation, and you can begin to understand how to create much more robust and much more powerful ways of communicating simple ideas.
Yes. Yes, that's beautiful, Jeff. Thank you so much. That's very stimulating, very opening, very expansive to hear everything that you're speaking about and everything that you're speaking towards. And I'm so grateful for your willingness to share some of your time with all of the things that you're doing. And by the way, all of the things that you have done, you've done an incredible amount to allow people to know more about Erickson and the evolution psychotherapy conferences. They're extraordinary. It's just remarkable, your contribution to the field. So I want to formally thank you from my person. And
thank you so much.
And
it means a lot.
In particular, for giving this time so that, as I mentioned, we can help to let more people know about the potential benefits of learning about hypnosis, Ericksonian hypnosis in particular, so that it can have its place, proper place, instead of being somewhat sidelined, which is just, it's too good for that. So thank you so much, Jeff, for everything that you're doing and you've done.
Well, thank you, because your love for hypnosis, your love for Erickson propels you to do something similar and to put onto the internet some of the most important figures in contemporary hypnosis, yourself included, and make sure that people are learning and have access to understanding more things about hypnosis. And I think that if people, put Milton Erickson into a browser, they would find the address of the Erickson Foundation, Erickson-Foundation.org. And we have lots of things that people can take advantage of if they look into those websites and get on our email list. Lots of things that we give out free for people who are interested in learning more. And that main website, Erickson-Foundation.org, gets you to many of the other websites that we have available. We have an archive, we have a museum, we have lots of enduring materials that people can take advantage of. And if they're interested in learning from some of the great minds, we probably have, from 1980 to the present, well, including all of the videos that we have of Dr. Erickson, we have a lot of material that people can take advantage of, including a lot of courses that we do, especially in Phoenix, Arizona. So thank you so much.
Yes, thanks for that, Jeff. I'm so glad that you mentioned the foundation and the website, because it's a very rich repository of resources there. Wonderful. Well, Jeff, should we stop there?
That's great. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Oh, that's a pleasure.